Kemi stood in front of the small wooden mirror in her family compound, adjusting the wrapper her mother had tied around her waist earlier that morning. The blue and yellow Ankara fabric catching the light that filtered through the window, her eyes were swollen from crying the night before, and she touched her face gently, wondering if anyone would notice the sadness she carried inside her chest like a heavy stone. Today was the day she would leave this village forever, traveling to Lagos with her uncle who had promised her parents that she would work in his shop and send money back home every month. She looked around her small room one last time, at the raffia mat where she had slept since she was a child, at the wooden box where she kept her few possessions, and at the letter she had written and rewritten 7 times until her fingers ached. The letter was folded carefully and tucked inside her wrapper, pressing against her ribs with every breath she took, reminding her of the words she had finally found the courage to write down after 3 years of keeping them locked inside her heart. Outside, she could hear her mother talking to the neighbors who had come to say goodbye, their voices mixing with the morning sounds of roosters crowing and children playing near the village stream. Her hands trembled as she picked up her small traveling bag, the one her father had bought from the market in town, and she wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life by leaving without speaking the words directly to the person she loved most in this world. Kemi walked slowly toward the village square where her uncle was waiting with his old Peugeot car, the one that made terrible noises whenever it climbed the hills leading out of Joe's. Every step felt heavier than the last, and she kept looking back at the paths between the compounds, hoping to see the face she desperately wanted to see one more time before she left. The other young women of the village had gathered to see her off, some wearing their best Ankara wrappers and head ties, others in simple cotton dresses, and they all hugged her and wished her well in the big city where they had never been. Her mother held her for a long time, crying softly into Kemi's shoulder, telling her to be careful and to remember all the things she had been taught about being a good woman, about working hard, and about never forgetting where she came from. Her father stood apart from the crowd of women, his face stern and unreadable in the way that fathers in the village always looked when their daughters were leaving home for the first time. Kemi's heart was beating so fast she thought everyone could hear it pounding in her chest, and she kept scanning the crowd for the one person who mattered more than all the others combined. Then she saw him walking toward the square, wearing his father's old agbada that was slightly too big for his thin frame, and her breath caught in her throat because even after all this time, the sight of him still made her feel like she was falling from a great height with nothing to catch her. His name was James, and he had been Kemi's friend since they were children playing together in the red dust of the village paths, building small houses from sticks and mud, and racing each other to the stream when the afternoon heat became too much to bear. He walked up to her with that familiar smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners, but Kemi could see something else in his expression today, something that looked like sadness or perhaps regret, though she could not be completely sure. They stood together away from the crowd for just a moment, under the shade of the old mango tree, where they had spent countless afternoons talking about their dreams and fears, and Kemi felt her hand move to her wrapper where the letter was hidden. She pulled it out carefully, the paper slightly warm from being pressed against her body, and she held it in her trembling hands while James watched her with confusion in his eyes. She told him that she had written something important, something she needed him to deliver to someone special, and her voice shook with every word she spoke because she was asking him to do something that could change everything between them and everyone involved. James took the letter from her hands and looked at it, turning it over to see the name she had written on the front in her careful handwriting. And when he saw whose name it was, his face changed in a way that Kemi could not quite understand at that moment. He promised her that he would deliver the letter that very afternoon, that he would make sure it reached the right person, and that everything would be taken care of before the sun set on the village that evening. The name written on the front of the letter was Michael, and everyone in the village knew who Michael was because he was the son of the retired headmaster, a young man who had finished secondary school and was now helping his father with the small farm they owned on the edge of the village. Michael was quiet and thoughtful, the kind of person who would rather read books under the shade of trees than join the other young men in their loud conversations and rough games near the village square. Kemi had loved him since she was 15 years old, from the first time she saw him helping an old woman carry her heavy basket of cassava from the farm, taking the load on his own shoulders without being asked, and walking the old woman all the way to her compound gate. She had loved him through 3 harvests and 3 rainy seasons, through festivals and funerals, through ordinary days and special occasions. But she had never found the courage to tell him because she was afraid of what he might say. Or worse, what he might not say. In the letter, she had written everything she felt, every emotion that had built up inside her over those long years, and she had told him that even though she was leaving for Lagos, even though she might be gone for a long time, she needed him to know that he was the reason her heart beat the way it did. James stood there holding the letter, and Kemi searched his face for some sign that he understood how important this was, how much it meant to her, and how delivering this letter was perhaps the most important thing anyone had ever done for her in her entire life. The old Peugeot rattled and shook as it carried Kemi away from everything she had ever known, the engine making sounds that seemed to protest every kilometer of the journey to Lagos. She sat in the back seat with her small bag on her lap, watching through the dusty window as the village grew smaller and smaller behind them until it disappeared completely into the green landscape of farms and forests. Her uncle drove in silence for most of the journey, occasionally pointing out towns they passed through or warning her about the dangers of the big city and the people she would meet there who might try to take advantage of a village girl who did not know the ways of urban life. Kemi barely heard his words because her mind was still in Jos, still standing under the mango tree with James, still watching him promise to deliver the letter to Michael before nightfall. She imagined how it would happen, how James would walk to Michael's family compound with the letter in his hand, how he would call Michael outside and give him the envelope, and how Michael would read her words and understand finally that someone loved him deeply and completely. She pictured Michael's face as he read the letter, wondered if he would smile or look surprised, wondered if he would feel the same way she did, and she felt a strange mixture of hope and terror that made her stomach turn in uncomfortable ways. The road to Lagos was long and dusty, taking them through small towns where vendors sold roasted corn and ground nuts by the roadside, through larger towns with markets full of people, and finally into the overwhelming chaos of Lagos itself, where the noise and crowds and endless traffic made Kemi feel like she had entered a completely different world that operated by rules she did not understand. After Kemi left in her uncle's car, James stood in the village square holding the letter in his hand, feeling the weight of it like it was made of something much heavier than paper and ink. The other villagers had returned to their daily activities, the women going back to their cooking fires and market preparations, the men heading to their farms or gathering under trees to discuss village matters. James looked down at the letter and saw Michael's name written in Kemi's beautiful handwriting, and something dark and painful twisted in his chest like a snake coiling around his heart. He had loved Kemi for as long as he could remember, loved her with a desperation that kept him awake at night, loved her so much that sometimes he thought the feeling would consume him entirely and leave nothing behind. He had watched her for years, hoping she would notice him as more than just a childhood friend, hoping that one day she would look at him the way she looked at Michael whenever she thought no one was watching. Now he held in his hands the proof that his hopes had been foolish, that Kemi's heart belonged to someone else, and that he had been living in a dream that would never become reality. James walked slowly toward Michael's family compound, his feet following the path they knew so well, but with every step he took, the anger and hurt inside him grew stronger and louder. He thought about how unfair it was that Michael, who barely spoke to Kemi, who seemed completely unaware of her existence most days, should be the one she loved, while he, James, who had been by her side through everything, meant nothing more to her than a convenient friend. James stood outside Michael's compound gate, hearing voices inside where Michael and his father were discussing something about the farm and the upcoming planting season. His hand was still gripping the letter, and sweat from his palm was beginning to make the paper slightly damp at the edges where his fingers pressed too hard. He raised his hand to knock on the wooden gate, but something stopped him, some force he could not name that made his arm freeze in midair. He stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, arguing with himself in his head about what he should do, about promises and friendship, and doing what was right. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand and stepped back from the gate, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Michael's family would hear it and come outside to investigate the strange sounds. James turned away from Michael's compound and walked quickly through the village paths, heading toward his own family home with the letter still clutched in his sweating hand. When he reached his small room at the back of his family compound, he sat on his sleeping mat and stared at the letter for a long time, watching how the afternoon light moved across the paper as the sun traveled across the sky. He told himself that he would deliver it tomorrow, that one day would not make any difference, that he just needed time to prepare himself for what would happen when Michael read Kemi's confession. But tomorrow came and went, and the letter remained with James, hidden now between the pages of an old school book on the wooden shelf where he kept his few possessions. And with each passing day, it became easier to convince himself that perhaps the letter was better left undelivered. Lagos was nothing like Jos, and Kemi spent her first weeks in the city feeling lost and overwhelmed by everything she encountered in this strange new world. Her uncle's shop was in a crowded market where hundreds of people pushed past each other every day, where the noise never stopped from morning until night, and where the air smelled of exhaust fumes and fried food and the sweat of too many human bodies pressed close together. She worked from dawn until after dark, helping her uncle sell fabrics and ready-made clothes to customers who haggled over every price and complained about every small imperfection they could find in the merchandise. The other workers in the shop were young people like herself, who had come from different villages across the country, all of them hoping to make money to send back to their families, all of them dreaming of better futures that seemed always just out of reach. At night, Kemi slept on a thin mattress in a small room she shared with 3 other girls, and she would lie awake listening to the sounds of the city that never seemed to sleep, thinking about home and wondering what had happened after she left. She wondered if James had delivered her letter as he promised, wondered if Michael had read it and understood her feelings, wondered if maybe Michael was even now trying to find a way to contact her in Lagos to tell her that he felt the same way. These thoughts kept her company during those difficult first months when everything felt strange and frightening, and they gave her hope that perhaps her life would not always be this hard, that perhaps love would find a way to bring her back to the village and to the person she had left her heart with. Back in Jos, Michael continued his simple life without any knowledge that someone had written him a letter confessing deep feelings of love and devotion. He woke early every morning to help his father with the farm work, clearing bush and planting yams and cassava in the red earth that their family had worked for generations. He was content with his quiet existence, reading books borrowed from the small library at the mission school, helping his mother with errands, and occasionally joining the other young men for palm wine under the stars when the day's work was finished. Sometimes he thought about Kemi and wondered vaguely how she was doing in Lagos, because he remembered her as a pleasant girl from the village who was always kind and respectful whenever they happened to meet on the village paths. He had no idea that she thought about him constantly, that his face appeared in her dreams, or that she had left behind words of love that should have reached him, but never did. James and Michael still saw each other occasionally in the village, and their interactions were normal and friendly, though James sometimes felt a burning shame in his chest when they spoke, remembering the letter hidden in his room that grew more impossible to deliver with each passing week and month. Michael never suspected anything was wrong, never questioned why James sometimes looked at him with an expression that mixed guilt and resentment, never knew that his life had been changed without his knowledge or consent by a decision someone else had made in a moment of weakness and jealousy. Time moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to human hopes and regrets, carrying everyone along whether they were ready or not. 1 year became 2, then 3, then 5, and still Kemi remained in Lagos working in her uncle's shop and sending money home to her parents every month, as she had promised. She had learned the ways of the city, had become someone who could navigate the chaotic streets and handle difficult customers and bargain in the markets with the best of them. Several men had shown interest in her over the years, city men with good jobs and nice clothes who came to the shop and tried to win her attention with compliments and promises. But Kemi kept her heart closed to all of them because she was still waiting for word from home, still believing that Michael had received her letter and that somehow, someday, they would find their way back to each other. Her parents wrote occasional letters telling her about village happenings, about births and deaths and marriages, and she always read these letters carefully, searching for any mention of Michael's name, any hint about his life or his feelings. Meanwhile, in Jos, James had grown into a man who carried a secret that weighed heavier on him with each passing year, a secret that shaped his choices and his relationships and his view of himself. The letter remained hidden in his room, now buried deeper among his possessions. And he had almost convinced himself that what he had done was not really betrayal, that he had simply chosen not to interfere in matters that were better left alone, that everyone was probably happier this way even if they did not know it. When Kemi turned 27, her parents began writing letters that were different from before. Letters that spoke carefully about duty and family and the importance of marriage for a woman who was no longer young. They mentioned a man from a neighboring village who had a good business and was looking for a wife, a man who would be able to provide well for a family and who came from a respectable lineage. Kemi read these letters with a sinking feeling in her stomach, understanding that her parents had given up on waiting for her to make her own choice, and were now preparing to arrange a marriage for her the way such things had always been done in their culture and community. She wrote back trying to explain that she was not ready, that she needed more time, but her letters seemed weak and unconvincing even to herself, because how could she explain that she was waiting for something that might never come? That she had given her heart to someone who had perhaps never even known she existed? Eventually, tired from years of hard work, worn down by the daily struggles of city life, and feeling guilty about disappointing her parents who had already sacrificed so much for her, Kemi agreed to return home for the marriage arrangements. The journey back to Joe's was nothing like her journey away, and she felt like a different person now, harder and more resigned, though somewhere deep inside she still carried that tiny flame of hope that refused to be completely extinguished no matter how many years had passed. The man Kemi married was named David, and he was exactly what her parents had described in their letters, solid and responsible and successful in his timber business, but completely wrong for her in every way that mattered. The wedding was held in the village with all the traditional ceremonies, Kemi wearing beautiful Ankara fabrics that had been specially made for the occasion, going through all the required rituals while feeling like she was watching everything happen to someone else from a great distance. She saw James at the wedding among the other guests, and for a moment their eyes met across the crowd, and she felt a strange sensation like something important was being communicated between them without words, though she could not understand what it meant. Michael was also at the wedding because everyone from the village attended such important occasions, and when Kemi saw him standing near his father, she felt that old familiar pain in her chest and wondered why he had never responded to her letter, why he had simply let her leave and never tried to contact her even once in all these years. She did not know that he had never received her confession, never known that she spent 3 years loving him from afar before she left, never been given the chance to decide whether he might have loved her back if he had only known. After the wedding, Kemi moved to David's compound in the neighboring village, and she tried to be a good wife even though her heart felt empty and cold like a house where no fire had been lit for many years. 2 years after Kemi's wedding, Michael's parents decided that it was time to marry as well, because he was approaching 30 and showed no signs of finding a wife on his own despite being a good catch by any village standard. They arranged for him to marry a young woman named Grace from a nearby town, a pretty girl with good manners who had finished secondary school and knew how to cook and manage a household properly. Michael agreed to the marriage without much argument because he was a dutiful son who respected his parents' wishes, and because he could not think of any good reason to refuse, even though his heart was not particularly invested in the arrangement. The wedding was smaller than Kemi's had been, but still included all the proper ceremonies and celebrations. And afterward, Michael and Grace settled into married life in a new house built near his father's compound. From the outside, everything looked correct and proper, but inside the marriage, something essential was missing. Some spark or connection that should exist between husband and wife but simply was not there despite everyone's best efforts. Grace tried hard to be a good wife, cooking Michael's favorite meals and keeping the house clean and treating his parents with respect. But she could feel that her husband's mind and heart were somewhere else, somewhere she could not reach, no matter how hard she tried. Michael went through the motions of married life feeling like he was playing a role in a story someone else had written, wondering sometimes if everyone felt this way, or if he was uniquely cursed to go through life without ever experiencing the kind of deep connection and passion that the old songs and stories talked about. The years continued their steady march forward, and both Kemi and Michael lived their separate lives in neighboring villages, so close to each other geographically but separated by circumstances and choices, and one undelivered letter that had changed everything without anyone knowing. Kemi had a daughter with David, a beautiful child she loved fiercely even though the marriage itself remained cold and distant, with David often away for his business and showing little interest in emotional connection when he was home. She had learned to live with disappointment, had taught herself to find meaning in taking care of her child and her household, had accepted that the dreams of her youth were just that, dreams that had no place in the practical reality of adult life. Michael and Grace remained childless despite years of trying, and this added another layer of tension and sadness to their already struggling marriage, with relatives on both sides making unhelpful comments and suggestions that only made things worse. Michael threw himself into farming and reading, spending long hours working in the fields or sitting under trees with books, avoiding the house and the wife, who looked at him sometimes with hurt and confusion in her eyes. James, meanwhile, had married a woman from another village and had 3 children, and he had built a fairly successful life selling palm oil and other goods in the local markets. But the secret he carried had hardened something inside him, had made him into someone who was successful but not quite happy, respected but not quite at peace with himself. When Kemi was 38 years old, her husband David died suddenly during one of his business trips, his heart giving out without warning while he was negotiating a timber contract in a town far from home. Kemi felt grief at his death, but it was the complicated grief of losing someone you were connected to by duty and circumstance rather than love, and she was ashamed of how much relief she also felt to be free from a marriage that had never felt right. After the funeral and the required mourning period, Kemi found herself at a crossroads, trying to decide what to do with the rest of her life now that she was a widow with a teenage daughter who would soon be ready for secondary school. Her parents were both elderly now and needed help, and her uncle in Lagos had written saying he was ready to retire and close the shop, so there was no reason for her to return to the city that had never quite felt like home. Slowly, Kemi began to realize that perhaps it was time to return to Joe's permanently, to come back to the village she had left 20 years ago, to face whatever memories and feelings still waited for her there. When she finally made the decision and packed up her life to move back, she felt both fear and strange excitement, like she was traveling towards something important, even though she could not say exactly what it was or why it mattered so much after all this time. The Joes that Kemi returned to in 2019 was both familiar and completely changed, like meeting an old friend who had aged and transformed while still retaining some essential quality that made them recognizable. The red earth paths were now mostly paved with concrete. Motorcycles and small cars had replaced most of the bicycles and foot traffic, and many of the old mud houses had been torn down and rebuilt with cement blocks and proper zinc roofing. Electricity had finally reached the village properly, with poles and wires running along the main roads, and several shops now sold cold drinks from electric refrigerators, a luxury that would have seemed impossible in Kemi's childhood. Her parents' compound had also changed, expanded, and improved with the money she had sent over the years, though her parents themselves had shrunk and slowed, becoming the kind of elderly people who spent their days sitting in the shade, watching the world go by. The first few weeks of her return were filled with visits from old friends and neighbors who came to welcome her back and to express sympathy for her widowhood, and Kemi went through these social obligations feeling like she was searching for something in every conversation, some piece of information or some feeling she could not quite name. She heard through casual village gossip that Michael was still living in his house near his father's compound, that his marriage to Grace was not happy though they stayed together because divorce was not something their families would accept, and that he had become quieter and more withdrawn over the years, spending most of his time alone rather than socializing with others. Kemi saw Michael for the first time since her return on a Saturday afternoon at the village market, where she had gone to buy vegetables and palm oil for her mother's cooking. He was standing near a stall selling farm tools, examining a new machete and talking to the seller about the quality of the blade, and for a moment Kemi simply stood still and watched him, taking in how he had changed and how he had stayed the same. He was heavier now than he had been at 20, his face fuller and showing the lines that time etches into everyone's features, but he still had that same quiet intensity about him, that way of focusing completely on whatever was in front of him, whether it was a machete blade or a conversation or a problem that needed solving. Kemi felt her heart do something complicated and painful in her chest, felt all those old feelings come rushing back as if 20 years had been erased in an instant, and she realized with a shock that she still loved him, had never stopped loving him despite marriage and motherhood, and all the years and distance that had tried to teach her to forget. Michael looked up and saw her standing there, and recognition moved across his face, followed by surprise and something else that Kemi could not quite read. They approached each other slowly in that crowded market, and when they finally stood face to face, the noise and activity around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving just the two of them suspended in a moment that felt heavy with all the things that had never been said. The conversation between Kemi and Michael in the market was polite and careful. The kind of conversation people have when they are trying not to reveal too much of what they are really thinking and feeling. They talked about safe topics, about her return to the village after so many years, about her parents' health, about his father who had recently recovered from a serious illness, about the changes in Jose and how different everything was from their childhood days. Neither of them mentioned her letter or the feeling she had confessed or the fact that he had apparently never acknowledged any of it. Because how could they discuss something like that standing in the middle of a crowded market with people walking past carrying baskets of yams and listening to their every word with curious ears? When they parted ways, Kemi felt confused and unsettled, wondering why Michael had never responded to her letter all those years ago, wondering if perhaps he had received it and simply had not felt the same way, wondering if she had built up a romantic fantasy in her mind that had never reflected reality. That night, she lay awake in her old room thinking about the encounter, and she decided that she needed to know the truth, needed to understand what had happened to her letter and why her life had taken the path it did, because she could not move forward without first understanding the past and all its mysteries and disappointments. It took Kemi 2 weeks to gather the courage to approach the subject, but finally she asked her mother if she knew anything about a letter that should have been delivered 20 years ago. Her mother looked at her with confusion, saying she knew nothing about any letter, and Kemi realized that her mother had never known about her feelings for Michael or about the confession she had written before leaving for Lagos. Then Kemi went to visit some of her old friends from childhood, women who were now mothers and traders and pillars of their community, and she asked them carefully if they remembered anything about her leaving or about James, and whether he had mentioned delivering anything to anyone. One of the women, Grace, who now happened to be Michael's wife, looked at her strangely when she asked this question, and Kemi felt embarrassed and guilty for bringing up the past, though she did not explain why she was asking. Finally, Kemi knew she would have to speak to James directly, that he was the only person who could tell her what had really happened to the letter she had entrusted to him, with such hope and faith on that morning so long ago. She found James at his shop in the market where he sold palm oil and other goods, and when he saw her walking toward him, something in his expression changed, a kind of fear or guilt that appeared and disappeared so quickly she almost missed it. She greeted him properly and they exchanged pleasantries about family and business, and then as casually as she could manage, Kemi asked the question that had been burning inside her for 20 years, asking him if he remembered the letter she had given him, asking him what had happened when he delivered it to Michael all those years ago. James's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock and guilt and fear and resignation. And Kemi knew immediately that something was terribly wrong even before he said a single word. They could not talk properly in the open market where everyone would hear and spread the story across the village by nightfall, so James closed his shop early and they walked together to the old mango tree near the village square, the same tree where Kemi had given him the letter 2 decades before. There, standing in the shade of branches that had grown thicker and fuller with age, James finally told her the truth, that he had been carrying like a curse all these years, told her that he had never delivered the letter to Michael, that he had kept it hidden instead because he had loved her himself and could not bear to give her happiness to another man. The words came out in a rush, mixed with apologies and explanations and justifications that sounded weak and pathetic even to James's own ears, and he watched as Kemi's face changed from confusion to understanding to a terrible kind of anger that made her whole body shake. She asked him where the letter was now, her voice cold and hard in a way he had never heard before, and James admitted that he still had it, that he had kept it all this time, though he could not explain why, except perhaps as evidence of his crime and his shame. Kemi demanded that he bring her the letter immediately, right now, this very moment. And something in her voice made James understand that this was not a request, but a command that he had no choice but to obey. James hurried to his house while Kemi waited under the mango tree, her mind spinning with the implications of what she had just learned, trying to understand how one person's selfish decision had shaped the entire course of her life and Michael's life and so many other lives connected to theirs. When James returned, he was carrying an old school book, and from between its pages, he carefully removed an envelope that had yellowed with age, the paper fragile and delicate from years of being hidden away. Kemi took the letter from him with shaking hands, seeing her own handwriting from 20 years ago, seeing Michael's name written in the careful script of her younger self, and she felt like she was holding not just a piece of paper, but a whole life that might have been. A door to a different future that had been closed without her knowledge or consent. She did not open the letter there in front of James, could not bear to read her own youthful words while standing near the man who had betrayed her trust so completely. So instead she told James in a voice that was quiet but filled with barely controlled fury that what he had done was unforgivable, that he had stolen something from her and from Michael that could never be returned, that he had played with their lives like they were toys for his own amusement and jealousy. James tried to apologize again, tried to explain that he had been young and stupid and consumed with his own feelings, but Kemi cut him off sharply, telling him that he had made his choices and would have to live with them just as she and Michael had been forced to live with the consequences of his actions for 20 years, and then she turned and walked away from him, leaving him standing alone under the mango tree with his guilt and his useless apologies. Kemi went home and sat in her room with the letter in her hands, and finally, after staring at it for what felt like hours, she carefully opened the envelope and read the words her younger self had written with so much hope and fear and love. The letter was exactly as she remembered writing it, full of honest emotion and careful explanations and a kind of innocent belief that speaking the truth would somehow make everything work out the way it was supposed to. Reading it now, as a 38-year-old widow who had lived through marriage and motherhood and disappointment and loss, Kemi felt both connected to and distant from the girl who had written these words. Understanding her feelings, but also seeing how naive and simplistic her view of love and life had been. But none of that changed the basic fact that this letter should have been delivered. That Michael should have had the chance to read it and respond to it, that their lives might have gone in completely different directions if James had simply kept his promise and done what he had said he would do. The next question was what to do now, whether to finally give the letter to Michael after all these years, or whether to simply destroy it and try to move forward without reopening old wounds that had finally started to heal. Kemi thought about this question for days, turning it over and over in her mind, asking herself what she really wanted and what would be fair to everyone involved, including Michael's wife Grace, who had done nothing wrong but marry a man whose heart was not fully available to her. In the end, Kemi decided that Michael deserved to know the truth, that whatever happened next, he should at least have all the information that had been kept from him for 2 decades. She sent word through a mutual acquaintance asking if Michael would meet her at the old mango tree in the evening when most villagers would be home with their families and they could talk privately without too many curious eyes watching. Michael came as requested, looking confused and uncertain about why Kemi had asked to see him. And she could see the years of unhappiness written in his face, the way his shoulders slumped slightly as if carrying an invisible weight, the way his eyes had lost some of the brightness she remembered from their youth. They sat together on the bench that had been built under the tree in recent years, and Kemi handed him the yellowed envelope without explaining first, watching his face as he took it and saw his own name written there in handwriting he did not recognize. She told him the story then, told him about writing the letter before she left for Lagos, about giving it to James with trust and hope, about learning only recently that it had never been delivered, and about the 20 years they had both lived without knowing what might have been different if he had received her confession at the time she wrote it. Michael opened the letter slowly and read it while Kemi watched, and she saw emotions move across his face like weather patterns, surprise and confusion giving way to understanding, and then to a deep sadness that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and fundamental in his soul. Michael read the letter twice, then a third time, and when he finally looked up at Kemi, his eyes were wet with tears that he did not bother to hide or wipe away. He told her that he had liked her too back then, that he had thought about her often and wondered if she might feel the same way he did. But he had been too shy and uncertain to say anything, and then she had left for Lagos and he had assumed that meant she was not interested in staying in the village or in any kind of relationship with someone like him. He said that if he had received the letter, if he had known how she felt, he would have found a way to go to Lagos, would have waited for her, would have built a life with her instead of the empty shell of a marriage he was currently trapped in. They sat together as darkness fell over the village, talking about all the moments they had missed, all the years that had been stolen from them, all the children they might have had together, all the happiness they might have shared. The anger they both felt toward James was enormous and overwhelming, a rage that seemed too big to be contained in their bodies, and they talked about confronting him together, about making sure everyone in the village knew what he had done. But underneath the anger was something else, a grief so deep and profound that it felt like standing at the edge of an endless ocean, mourning not just for what they had lost, but for the people they had become in the absence of what they should have had, the bitter and incomplete versions of themselves that had been shaped by loneliness and disappointment and marriages that were obligations rather than partnerships. The story of the undelivered letter spread through the village like fire through dry grass, and everyone had opinions about what should happen next and who was to blame and whether forgiveness was possible or even desirable. James's reputation suffered terribly, with many people refusing to do business with him or acknowledge him on the street, treating him like someone who had committed a crime against the entire community by interfering with fate and stealing possibilities from two people who had deserved better. His wife stood by him through the scandal,